In 1999, the post office began installing a computer system called Horizon in every branch across the United Kingdom. Within months, the accounts of individual postmasters began showing unexplained shortfalls. The post office told its postmasters the system was reliable. It told them the shortfalls were their fault. It prosecuted them for theft, for false accounting, for fraud. It sent them to prison. It bankrupted them. It destroyed their reputations in their communities. It did all of this while knowing, at the highest levels of the organization, that the Horizon system had faults. 736 people were convicted. Some lost their homes, some lost their marriages. 4 of them died before the truth was publicly acknowledged. And the post office has not yet produced a single criminal conviction against any of the executives who made those decisions. That is what getting away with it looks like in Britain. And it is not the only example. In this video, we are counting down 12 British institutions that got away with it. Organizations, authorities, and bodies that caused documented harm to thousands of people, that covered up what they had done, and that emerged from the process of exposure with their structures largely intact, their most senior decision-makers largely unprosecuted, and the people they harmed still waiting for something that looks like justice. Stay with me to the end, because number 1 is an institution so large, so embedded in British life, and so skilled at absorbing scandal without producing accountability, that most people cannot quite bring themselves to say what it is out loud. In May 2019, British Steel entered compulsory liquidation. But the story of British Steel and its environmental record in Scunthorpe is considerably longer and considerably darker than the 2019 collapse. For decades, the steel operations in Scunthorpe operated coke ovens that released toxic emissions into the surrounding community. Residents reported health concerns. Environmental monitoring data was collected. The Environment Agency issued notices. Enforcement action was taken, and then not taken, and then taken again, across a period of years during which the pollution continued. The specific health outcomes for the Scunthorpe population, attributable to decades of elevated toxic emissions, have never been the subject of a comprehensive, independent study. The people who lived downwind of the coke ovens, who breathed the air that the monitoring equipment recorded as exceeding safe limits, have never received a systematic health assessment. British Steel as an entity has changed ownership and corporate form so many times that any direct line of accountability for the decades of environmental record leads through a series of corporate restructurings to an endpoint that does not exist anymore. The people in Scunthorpe are still there. In 2001, the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales published the Nolan Report, the first independent inquiry into child protection within the Catholic Church in England and Wales. The report found significant failures in how the Church had handled allegations of child sexual abuse. A second review in 2007 found that implementation of recommendations had been inconsistent. A third review in 2021, the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, found that the Catholic Church had consistently placed the reputation of the institution above the protection of children, that it had moved offending priests to new parishes where they offended again, that it had failed to report known abusers to the police, and that it had actively misled victims and their families about what was known. The independent inquiry identified over 900 individuals who had made allegations of child sexual abuse within the Catholic Church in England and Wales. The number of prosecutions of those who had enabled or concealed the abuse is effectively 0. The Church continues to operate as an institution of significant social influence in England and Wales. Its property holdings, its school network, its charitable sector activities, and its public role have not been fundamentally altered by the findings of multiple independent inquiries. On the night of the 22nd of April, 1993, 18-year-old Stephen Lawrence was murdered at a bus stop in Eltham, southeast London. 5 suspects were identified within days. None was successfully prosecuted for over 18 years. The Macpherson Inquiry, reporting in 1999, found that the Metropolitan Police investigation had been marred by professional incompetence, institutional racism, and a failure to treat Stephen Lawrence's murder with the seriousness it deserved. 2 of the original suspects were finally convicted in January 2012, 19 years after the murder. The other suspects have never been convicted. The Metropolitan Police officers, whose failures were documented in detail by the Macpherson inquiry, were not subjected to criminal proceedings arising from those failures. Several retired on full pensions. A subsequent inquiry found evidence that an undercover police officer had been deployed to gather intelligence on the Lawrence family and their supporters rather than on the suspects, an operation that had no lawful justification and was not sanctioned by any senior officer, who has subsequently been held accountable for authorizing it. In 1968, the British government oversaw the merger of the major British car manufacturers into British Leyland. By 1975, the company was effectively bankrupt and was nationalized. Between 1968 and the eventual collapse across the 1980s and 1990s, British Leyland consumed billions of pounds of public money, produced cars of deteriorating quality, experienced chronic industrial relations crises, and systematically failed to invest in product development and manufacturing modernization. The internal management decisions, the government decisions about how much money to provide, and the union decisions about the strikes that disrupted production during critical competitive periods were examined in various inquiries across the decades of the company's existence. No individual executive was held criminally accountable for the use of public money. No government minister was held accountable for the decisions that turned a struggling industry into a collapsed one. The communities whose employment depended on British Leyland, the Longbridge workers in Birmingham, the Cowley workers in Oxford, the workers across the Midlands, absorbed the consequences of decisions made in boardrooms and government offices without meaningful recourse. The car industry that was built over a century is gone. The accountability for how it ended is still being debated. Peter Ball was the Bishop of Gloucester and subsequently the Bishop of Lewes. In 1992, he resigned as Bishop of Gloucester, following a police investigation. He was cautioned by police, and the church allowed him to continue officiating in a private capacity. Ball remained in contact with senior figures in the church, with members of the royal household, and with other figures of social significance. He was relicensed as a minister in 1997. In 2015, he was convicted of 19 offenses of indecent assault and gross indecency against 18 victims over a period spanning 3 decades. He was sentenced to 32 months in prison. The independent inquiry into child sexual abuse found that senior figures in the church had taken steps that prioritized Ball's welfare and reputation over those of his victims, that the church had been aware of more allegations than were disclosed to the police in 1992, and that the network of establishment connections Ball had cultivated had been a factor in the protection he received. No senior church figure was prosecuted in connection with the handling of Ball's case. Prince Charles, who had corresponded with Ball during the period of his police caution, was not required to give evidence to the inquiry. In August 2014, a report by Professor Alexis J. documented that at least 1,400 children had been subjected to child sexual exploitation in Rotherham between 1997 and 2013. The report found that the abuse had been known about by Rotherham Metropolitan Borough Council and by South Yorkshire Police for years, that concerns raised by social workers and voluntary sector organizations had been ignored or suppressed, and that some victims had been treated as willing participants in their own abuse rather than as children in need of protection. The report found that some officials had deliberately underplayed the scale of the problem, partly for fear of being seen as racist. Subsequent investigations expanded the number of identified victims. In the years following the J report, Rotherham Council was placed in special measures. Several council officials resigned. South Yorkshire Police underwent successive reviews. A small number of perpetrators were convicted. The number of police officers and council officials prosecuted for their failure to protect children, despite being aware of the abuse, is effectively zero. Between 1,970 and 1,991, approximately 30,000 people in the United Kingdom were given blood products contaminated with HIV and hepatitis C through the National Health Service. Most of the patients were hemophiliacs who needed regular blood product infusions. The blood products used were largely imported from the United States, collected from paid donors, including prison populations and other high-risk groups. The NHS and the Department of Health were warned about the risks. The warnings were not acted upon with the urgency the risk required. Approximately 3,000 people died as a direct result of the contaminated blood they received. For decades, successive governments and health authorities denied that the contamination was known about in advance. The Infected Blood Inquiry, reporting in 2024, found that there had been a cover-up that spanned decades and multiple governments, that documents had been deliberately destroyed, that patients had been given contaminated products without their informed consent, and that the cover-up had been sustained at the highest levels of government and the health service. The inquiry's report described the contaminated blood scandal as the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. As of the time of this video's production, not a single criminal prosecution of any NHS official, government minister, or civil servant involved in the cover-up has been brought. In September 2012, the Hillsborough Independent Panel published its report into the deaths of 97 people at Hillsborough Stadium on the 15th of April, 1989. Its findings were explicit. The police had altered over 160 witness statements to remove criticism of their own conduct. Police and emergency service failures had caused or contributed to the deaths, and a concerted campaign had been mounted to deflect blame onto the supporters. These findings confirmed what the families of the dead had been saying for 23 years. A new inquest returned a verdict of unlawful killing in 2016. Criminal proceedings followed against a former police commander, a former police solicitor, and others. The criminal prosecutions resulted in acquittals and abandoned trials. As of the time of this video's production, no individual has been successfully prosecuted for the deaths of 97 people at Hillsborough or for the subsequent cover-up that lasted 23 years. The families have been told, repeatedly and at intervals of years, that new proceedings might be brought. No convictions have followed. Jimmy Savile was one of the most prominent figures in British broadcasting for over 4 decades. He raised hundreds of millions of pounds for charity. He was knighted. He was appointed to the board of Broadmoor Hospital. He was, simultaneously, one of the most prolific sexual abusers in British criminal history, abusing an estimated 450 people, including children as young as 5, over a period of more than 50 years. He died in October 2011. The full extent of his crimes became publicly known in October 2012. The subsequent police investigation and NHS review found that Savile had abused patients in hospitals, abused children on BBC premises, and had been enabled by a culture of deference, celebrity, and institutional protection embedded in both organizations. The BBC's own review found that there had been clear opportunities to act on information about Savile's behavior available to senior figures within the organization. Those opportunities were not taken. No BBC executive has been prosecuted in connection with the abuse that occurred on BBC premises or with the failure to act on information about Savile. No NHS official has been prosecuted in connection with the abuse that occurred in NHS facilities. The institutional culture that enabled Savile to operate without consequence for 50 years has been the subject of extensive review, but the individuals who were senior within those institutions have not been held to account in any criminal forum. In the early hours of the 14th of June, 2017, a fire that started in a refrigerator on the 4th floor of Grenfell Tower spread up the outside of the building with catastrophic speed due to highly flammable aluminium composite cladding applied during a recent refurbishment. 72 people died. The Grenfell Tower inquiry, producing its final report in 2024, found that the fire was the result of decades of failure by the manufacturer of the cladding, which had engaged in systematic dishonesty about its fire safety properties, by the building contractor, by the government, which had failed to ensure fire safety regulations kept pace with the widespread use of similar cladding, and by the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea and its tenant management organization, which had repeatedly ignored fire safety concerns raised by residents. The residents who raised concerns were not heard. 62 of the 72 who died were from Black, Asian, or minority ethnic backgrounds. As of the time of this video's production, no criminal charge in connection with the Grenfell Tower fire has been brought against any individual or organization. The Metropolitan Police has said that criminal charges are being considered. They have been saying this for 7 years. The post office prosecuted 736 people between 1,999 and 2015, using evidence from the Horizon accounting system that it knew was unreliable. Sub-postmasters and their assistants were prosecuted for theft and false accounting. They were convicted, they went to prison, they were made bankrupt. They lost businesses their families had operated for generations. The post office knew, from the earliest years of the system's operation, that Horizon had bugs that could produce false shortfalls. It knew because its own investigators had found the bugs. It knew because the company that supplied the system, Fujitsu, had identified problems. It knew because sub-postmasters were telling it, repeatedly, that the figures did not match reality. It prosecuted anyway. It prosecuted not because it believed the sub-postmasters were guilty, but because prosecution was cheaper than acknowledging the system's failures. In 2024, the Post Office Horizon System Offenses Act quashed all convictions. A public inquiry has taken extensive evidence. The full picture of who knew what, when, and who made the specific decisions that sent innocent people to prison is documented in that inquiry's evidence. As of the time of this video's production, no post office executive has been charged with any criminal offense. The chair of the post office during the relevant period was appointed to a significant public role after the scandal became public. Paula Venables, the chief executive, received a CBE in 2019 for services to the post office. She returned it in 2024 under public pressure. The sub-postmasters who were wrongfully convicted are still pursuing full compensation. Some have died waiting. The people who made the decisions that destroyed their lives are free. They have their pensions. They have, for the most part, their reputations in the circles that matter to them, and no one has charged them with anything. That is what getting away with it looks like in Britain. That is what it has always looked like in Britain.